Hi, everybody. The aim of this conversation is an intergenerational one. So, we want to think about the learnings of the generations that came before us. Um, how did they traverse the challenges of race and class as Christian women in their generation? And so that's why my mom and I have decided to kind of set up this intergenerational conversation between us. Both of us do quite a bit of mentoring of younger leaders. Of course, her generation will be a far vaster and more populous group than mine. But we mentor different generations, and what we've come to see is that there is a need for this kind of intergenerational conversation.
Well, thank you very much. My name's Esme, and we live in Cape Town. We are two women of color. I'm the mother, in case you didn't know that, and this is my daughter, Nadine. One of the things that I really enjoy is talking about the past and learning from the past. And so we've decided that Nadine would ask me a few questions and I would ask her a few questions. And this is the way we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, so we'll freestyle it. You'll see a little bit of our personalities come through and our mother-daughter dynamic. And for both of us, we've done this a little bit before, but I think this is the first time on this particular topic. So we also felt that there wasn't enough time for both of us to share our full journeys. But I want to start with my mom telling us a little bit about your journey towards understanding God's heart for justice within the South African context. We are both aware this is a different context to the US one, and we hope to fill it in as we go along. But I'd like my mom to tell us a little bit about her journey.
Thank you. The journey of justice starts right in the home. And for me, my journey started as I watched my mother and my grandmother, who lived with us, actually do the actions of justice. My grandmother was just an amazing woman, and she taught justice in a very real way. And when I talk about justice, it's about doing good to people, being kind, being compassionate, making sure that they're living a space of God's love and God's shalom. So let me tell you a story very quickly. One day, my grandmother came from a meeting, a church meeting, late at night. And on her way home from the station, she was robbed. This young man grabbed a bag. All she was left with was a handle of a handbag. The next morning, she shared it with us, and we were all very distressed. The afternoon, this young man came knocking at the door, because in my grandmother's handbag was her address and all her documents, and he thought he would come and return these documents to her. She was very grateful, but she was also going to teach him a lesson, because when she opened her purse, she found he had taken all the money she had. And so she said to him, "You will come and work for me tomorrow and the day after, and I will pay you. I will show you what it is to live justly before people." So this young man came for the first day, and we fed him well and we were good to him. The next day he came again, and my grandmother gave him the money. And then she said to him, "Now you will pay me back what you took out of the purse." He was quite shocked, but he gave the money back. She said, "Every month you can come and work in my garden and I will pay you." And so this developed into a relationship where I began to see that it's not only when people do wrong to you that you do wrong to them, but you also find a way for them to be freed from their guilt. And so this whole journey of striving for justice in South Africa is one that we want to make sure that we are doing right in God's sight. My grandmother was a real deep Christian, and she taught me some things, and there are some things that stick in my head still today. And this is it. You do right in God's sight, no matter the consequences. She didn't throw the Bible at us, though she read the Bible every day. But one of the things that she kept on teaching us about is to do what is fair and just, and be compassionate and humble, for we do not live in this world on our own, but we must have a broader view, not only of our family, but of society at large. And so as she lived this out, She taught me what was to do right in God's sight, to be fair with people, people of other race, people of other gender, people of other societal strata in which we lived. She was the same to everybody. And I think for all of us, as we listen to this conversation, we need to realize it starts in our homes. This intergeneration transferring of what is right and doing right in God's sight. But that wasn't only what happened in our house. We were also a very politically aware family. Many of our members had been fighting the apartheid regime, and so they had been incarcerated. And so here we saw a family that was always discussing and anxious around the injustices that were happening in our country. As a young girl, I listened to all these conversations. As an older teenager at my own school, we began to engage in the whole issue of transforming our society, beginning with students. And so I was a student activist, helping our students think correctly around what was happening about the unjust laws in South Africa, the oppression that we blacks were experiencing, and then all of a sudden came this law that each one of us would have to be moved to another area, the law of transforming us from a multicultural, multiracial society into putting us into silos in certain areas. And many of my friends had to move from the houses that they've lived in. Their families, their grandmothers had to move from these houses that they had bought years ago. They had to move from the communities. These communities were disrupted. And so as we began to experience this, we began to get more and more angry. And this is where the student uprising began in 1976. And I was at high school at that time, and I led what we did at our school in standing in solidarity with the others that were uprising in their school. So it is family, it is school, but church as well. In the church that I belonged to was Methodist Church. And they were really subversive in many ways because they opened conversations about racial injustice within all the young people. And we used to have these conversations at our youth groups. Our church actually organized spaces where we could meet people from other races, because at that time we were in such racial silos that we never met each other. And so they created opportunities for us at camps to meet other people. It wasn't just meeting, but the programs were actually geared to make us sensitive to people of other races so that we could get on with them. And I know, and when I look back, and this is almost 55 years later, I look back and I see what they wanted to achieve. Because many of my friends who were part of that Methodist circle, blacks, whites, coloreds, Indians, we have become leaders in our society. And when we meet each other, we remember that we had met each other at these camps. They were called sensitivity camps. They were subversive. They were multiracial. And the government hated it. And often we would find that the police would come and do a raid on the camp. I would never forget one day we were at a camp and we all young people were praying together, and suddenly somebody came in and said, "Guys, you need to pack up and go." It was in the middle of the night. At 1 o'clock in the morning, we packed our combis and we all scattered. We heard later that 20 minutes later, the police arrived with their sirens blaring, coming to break up the camp. But we had moved out already. So the church played a huge role in sensitizing us and preparing us for racial harmony in the future. And when I look back, I think that they were really progressive in creating that space for us. So yes, my heart for justice is born in my family. It's born in my school, my upbringing, my education, and all the people who've been part of my education, but also in my local church, because individuals in that church had a vision to see South Africa as a multiracial society where we would work together and live together in peace. Of course, it took us a long time before we came to that peace, but that is another story.
For another day.
For another day.
So I think the interesting thing about these stories, Mommy, is that in terms of the home life situation, this was definitely carried on to me. And it's very interesting. Some of my friends who are also like us, people of color, would say, but our parents never spoke about these things. And so when they came into an environment, professional environments, which was still largely white dominated, even though in South Africa, people of color, black people, are not a minority, they are a majority in terms of education and opportunities. We were often not afforded what white people were. And so for me, it was very different because I think I was prepared in the home environment for the future. You kind of, I think you and Dad had a dream about what a new South Africa could be like. So when I entered spaces like historically white universities where I work today, even as a student, I think just post 1994, which was the advent of our democracy, I was almost more ready for that space than that space was for me in a way. So I wanted to ask you, are there any specific moments, so you've talked about your early life, but are there any specific moments on your church and justice journey, if you will, or your faith and justice journey, that stand out for you in terms of church leadership? So for those that don't know, when I was a child, my mother was a fashion designer. And a real one at that. She designed for the rich and famous, many politicians too. And she was at the same time, she was a minister's wife and a church leader within our denominational structures, which is Church of God. In the US context here, we called the Full Gospel Church of God. And later on, she began to take up a global role. I think as I became a teenager, you started to travel more internationally, and nationally and internationally, you became more renowned. So, yeah, specific moments in your journey that stand out for you in terms of the church struggle, if you will, with regards to racism and sexism.
Well, here is a story, and I'm going to tell this to Nadine. When I was pregnant, I was going to have the next Billy Graham.
Oh, and she only has one, by the way.
I only have this daughter. The next Billy Graham. He was going to bring many people to the Lord. He was going to change the face of Africa through the power of the gospel. And so I carried this child. Now, in those days, we didn't have all the scopes and the scans that you have yesterday. And so you just got what you got. And so when this baby was born, they said to me it was a girl. Oh my golly, all my dreams that I had for this child were shattered. And I remember standing at the window that morning, the sun was coming through, with this little baby in my hands. And I looked at her and I said, well, my girl, you will still serve God. Because I know that there is a glass ceiling for women. But I will do everything I can to open doors for you, that you can serve God and His purposes in your generation. Because my generation is almost a lost generation. We are fighting this for so long, but I will do what I can. And so that was the beginning of me realizing the challenges that women have to serve God in the church. As I stood with this little girl baby in my hand, and I foresaw all the battles that she was going to have to fight, and the battles I would have to fight, not only for her, but for her generation to open the doors. So we realized that sometimes these kind of events in your life open your eyes and make you more determined to do what you already have in your heart. When we had the birth of our new democracy in 1994, we were all hoping that things would change dramatically. We were hoping that racism would be gone, that sexism would be gone, that the church would change, but it didn't. Because within our own church context, we were divided into 4 different departments: the whites, the coloreds, the Indians, and the Africans. That's what they call.
Okay, you have to explain that division.
Right, so
because you don't have that in other countries.
Yes, we have whites. We have colored people like us, which is called so-called colored people.
In America, we know this is a derogatory term. In South Africa, it was too. It was a government-given term, but it meant mixed race.
Right. And then we had the Indians, and they were a very small minority. And then we have the indigenous black Africans, and those were the major people in our whole country. And so our church, our own church, was divided into these silos, these racial departments. And when I married my husband into this church, this is what we found. It was a terrible disgrace for me and for my husband. And one of the things that we determined during our stay in leadership would be to see how much change we could bring, how much unity we could bring. And so began a journey of convincing people that we are all equal before God. Can you believe that? Convincing people that we are all equal before God. Eventually, we were able to get a group of people from the white department who were willing to come in. All the people from the colored, the Indian, and the black department came in and formed a united assemblies. And so within ourselves, we determined that we believed in John 17:20, the unity of the body, and this will make us more effective in the work God has called us to. Fortunately, we have come a long way. Eventually, the whole church, the white group that remained distinct, joined that. But I can tell you it was a huge struggle. And how did we win the battle? We won the battle through relationships. We won the battle through inviting people to our house around our round table, which could seat 10 people. And we would have the conversations, and people will begin to discover each other across the racial barriers and find out that they had the same problems. Each one had the same problems in their ministry. They began to find out that their children were the same. They began to find out that we were just human beings. And this brought a unity, a deep unity, because it was something that we worked towards. It didn't happen overnight. It took us a few years to get there, but we worked at it. And this is when we talk about racism and trying to move that aside. But besides that, I had another agenda. My agenda was to make sure that women had an equal voice in this new church that we were forming. And so I would cook the meals, I would serve the meals, and when I was finished, my husband would get up and clear the table and give me his chair to sit in, and I would raise the issue of what they thought of women in leadership, what they thought of women's role. And very many of them had very antiquated ideas of what women should be doing. But I was so grateful that I had been exposed to people like Catherine Kruger, who had shared with me her materials and her publications. And so both my husband and I began reading this, and it changed our thinking, and it helped us and gave us a theological grip on how to share with people from the Bible what the Bible says about women. And so this has been my journey in helping our church not only become a united church, but also become a church where they are more open to the ministry of women. I can tell you that one of the things I found was women are the people who are actually making the change. I became the president of the women's ministry, and I decided while I would be there that I would run camps. I would call it leadership training camps. It had to be multiracial. And so we would camp together for 3 days. All the women leaders in a particular area, I set it out. And it would be every racial group would be there. Some of these women had never ever spoken to a black woman or a white woman. Some of these women had never ever prayed with them. And so at the first day, it was very, very strange for everybody. But I really had a group of people praying for all of this to happen, so that it would not only be an experience of them finding each other, but it would be much deeper than that. I can tell you at the end of every camp, people's minds were transformed, just like during my early years as a teenager in the Methodist Church, where we met together and had the sensitivity training. I used many of the same methodologies right in those areas. and women began to find each other, and they formed deep friendships. And when they got home, they told their husbands, they are no different to us. And so if you want to bring about racial harmony within a church, you need to be prepared to work at it. It also costs you, because you can imagine I was labeled all kinds of things, and it didn't bother me at all, because I was aware of what my journey was. I was aware of what my agenda was, and I knew God was with me. And so I was really grateful for the relationships that I built over these many years, and for the small role I could play in bringing unity.
Mommy, now I want to just stop you there. You spoke about Daddy as well and his role. So what role do men, spouses, I mean in my own life too, I think I have a very supportive spouse. What role do spouses play in terms of this kind of justice journey? And I want to tell you that the last story that she told, my dad was one of the denominational leaders at that time, and he came back to say the men have been asking, can't they have similar camps? And so it spread far further than that. But what sort of ally, we need to talk about allyship, I think. We often talk about white allies in the struggle, but also male allies.
Well, when we got married, my husband was the theologian and I was the fashion designer. So I wasn't very theologically trained, but one of the things I was determined to do was to become the best pastor's wife that there was. I didn't care if pastors' wives think nothing of themselves, but I really thought I have an opportunity to impact people's lives. So we decided that every book he reads, I would read. And so we began a journey of reading together. And as we understood the concepts theologically, we could discuss it, and we were on the same page. There were interesting times and journeys when I moved out of the church, and I began to be invited to other spaces, because post 1994, people wanted to make sure that every committee had a woman of color, and particularly churches. So there weren't many church women like me around who had this kind of exposure.
Sadly, they still aren't, but yes.
And so they invited me to their boards to make up their quotas, this black woman. Unfortunately, I was no quota. I really said what I needed to say. And so in these boards, which were always dominated by white people, suddenly came this woman they've not had women before. Now they've got this woman who thinks very different to them. And you can imagine the amount of clashes. Many of these board meetings were held outside of Cape Town, so I had to fly into the meetings. I'd leave home early in the morning. My husband would drop me at the airport at 5 o'clock, and he would pick me up at the airport again at 10 o'clock at night. Very often, I would have had a hard time trying to convince these people of what was right, what was just, what was fair in this new South Africa. And I would arrive home with my feathers ruffled, sometimes my wings broken. And I would get into the car, and my husband would look at me and he'd say, rough day, I'm not going back there again ever. I've had enough of these guys. I'm not doing this. And you know what he would do? He would just calm my feathers down. He would fix that wing that was broken. He'll say, that's what God has called you to. You will go back. I'm supporting you. And so I always had the courage to go back to these committees where people who really didn't like me, didn't want me, would have liked to got rid of me. I was there because I had the support of my husband. And so this is a very important journey. I say to women, you need to get your spouses. Racism and sexism must not be a battle at home. It must be something that you are agreed on, that you talk about, and when you go out there, you speak with one voice.
Yeah. And a lot of this is quite emotional for me. You'll see my mother is not the emotional one. I'm the emotional one. I inherited that from my father. So I think it's emotional because we're still fighting similar battles. There are still many spaces in South Africa or in international arenas. Both my mother and I think me more as an academic, my mother as a church leader, we'd be serving on committees now, often representing the global South, still being the affirmative action token candidate. And I do remember coming to her, I think a few years ago, and saying, I've been approached to be on this committee, and I'm very aware of the fact that I'm the token Global South woman, and I don't want to be that token Global South woman. And my mother said to me, as long as you don't think you're the token, that's fine. Go and make sure you represent. So I think that's one of the things I learned from you is, even if people think you are the token, you have to represent, because you are bringing into that space many, many marginalized voices in terms of race, in terms of gender, and maybe even in terms of class. So we still have many challenges to face in terms of
And what are the challenges you face in your space?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are similar. I think we're seeing globally, but also locally in the South African context. For some strange reason, I suppose Solomon said there is nothing new on this earth. A rise in right-wing rhetoric that seeks to silence people of color talking about their oppressions, and women also, and that is infecting the church space as well. So I think I'm a little bit resentful and emotional about the fact that my generation, which I think you had dreamed would not have to face these challenges, and I pray not my daughter's generation, are having to reconfront these challenges within society, but also still within the church. And yet in South Africa, almost 80%, if not more, are Christians, or at least confess to be Christian. And yet we have these constant running battles, if you will, within those contexts. I think for me, these are still challenges, and I think in a way I've been thinking about how do we go about confronting them again. And some of these things you're mentioning is perhaps where we need to go back to. So on the one hand, there's impatience because one feels structural injustice still exists, and we can't just sit on the interpersonal level. On the other hand, I think what you're saying in terms of the interpersonal is also important. And then I think for me, to constantly keep in mind that there is a spirituality behind these issues. The evil one does not want these issues to be confronted. And so not to just fight the people, the individuals, but to understand that there is actually evil behind these particular systems. And you talked about prayer support. I think that's, in my generation, we need to continually be telling ourselves, reminding each other that all of these actions need to be undergirded by prayer, supplication, even fasting,
So you work in an academic environment, and you train practitioners, you train clergy, people who go back to their environment. You work with people of all different races. How do they, in the space where they engage you, feel about you as a woman of color lecturing them?
Of course, my mother knows the answer to that one. I think they're often surprised. I look a lot younger than I am. I think you can see the gray hair. I'm not as gray as my mother yet. But there are still those barriers. But I think for me, I always say, my colleagues have asked me, and even some of the students, why are you so free in these spaces? And I think that one of the key things that you taught me and Dad taught me is every space is our space because we are created in the image of God, each one of us. So there is no space that God didn't create and that God doesn't own. And so when I walk into a space, I still feel free. Even if people have whatever view of me, that doesn't matter. I still feel free to walk into that space and to own it as a child of God, in service of God. I think there's a very fine line between arrogance and understanding your positionality in God and what you're there and what you're called to do. So I think that for me has helped me navigate those spaces, especially in, and as I would say, a historically white university, even though my university today is transforming. Once again, recently we had another racist incident. And so there are still those vestiges of whiteness, of patriarchy as systems of power operating within that environment. And I do think spirituality is key, even when I'm working outside of my faculty, in the broader university environment. I do that as a Christian woman. I don't just do it, and as a theologian, of course. And so that's also led to very interesting conversations on campus with other colleagues who are not confessed Christians. So this goes to the whole issue of, particularly, I think, the generation that comes behind me now. So it's you, me, and then there's a generation behind me in their 20s. I'm in my 40s, you in your 70s, and then, yeah, those in their 20s and their early 30s, many of whom who have left the church, who have been very angry with the church because of its inactivity with regards to issues of injustice. So what carried you through the hard times? How did you use your faith as a resource in your activism? Just talking about what I've spoken about a little bit. That's a question that I get from the generation behind me.
Well, I love the church, and I believe that God has called the church to be the church in society, to be the agent of change in society. And so everybody who's part of this church should be looking at issues of justice. And for me, I see this new generation looking at issues of justice, yet the church is not speaking about it because they caught up in their own, let's get bigger, let's be fancier, let's do a bigger building, and they're not really dealing with the real issues that's touching people's lives. So unfortunately, yes, there is a falling away of young people, but I'm encouraging young people that I mentor to be the new generation who will call them to a space where they can begin to talk about it and say, what changes can we bring to the church? Because you see, we can see the church just as the hierarchy, but there's also the opportunity for the laity, the underground laity, to be the change makers. And sometimes we are only looking at the leadership. And so just like we did in our space as a young teenager doing the underground stuff, I'm encouraging young people, be a rebel, do the underground stuff, talk about the issues of justice, because I do want to see this next generation rising up, a generation of people who not only talk about justice but love and compassion and bring God's power and purposes to the places where they are. And so we cannot lose them. We dare not lose them. They need to be part of what we are doing together. The issue around sexism, some of them raise the issue that the churches are sexist and that women have no role to play in leadership. And this is still something that we are addressing. I was at the World Evangelical Alliance conference in 2019 in Indonesia, and somebody stood up and asked a question, can women give leadership? And I was sitting on the panel, and so they looked to me and they smiled and they said, Esme will answer that. And I said, leadership is not about power and position. Leadership is about serving, servanthood. Anybody can serve. And so as I started to speak about servant leadership, this person was still standing on his feet. He slowly sat down. And afterwards he came to me and he said, that was so profound, I've forgotten that we are to be servants. And so I say to any young person, you may not have the position or the authority to bring about the change that you think, but God has put you in a place of authority. He's positioned you, and you can do this in a very underground way. Be articulate about what you want to bring changes about and work together with others. Don't be a lone ranger. Don't just drop off. But I want to encourage young people. I want to encourage parents to encourage their children to continue to fight the battles that you maybe have fought, that you're tired of fighting, but we really need our young people to continue to take the church forward. And the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and it will continue, but we really need quality people who are thinking through these issues. And I know there are lots of organizations who are dealing with this and who will come into churches to educate them And I really appreciate the work of CBE and the work they do and the publications they've put out, because I can refer these people to your website. I can say, go to the
I
CBE.
do the same.
Yes, go there, read up, so that you can be educated, that you can have an articulate voice into these spaces, which we find are difficult to sometimes navigate because it's a very emotional space.
Yeah. I mean, recently I had one of my younger colleagues, not in my particular university, but a younger black woman, say to me, she is just exhausted. She's emotionally tired. She's tired of fighting these battles. In her 20s, bright, articulate, what I would call a rising star within our theological space. I think in a few years internationally too. And she just said to me, what do I do? And I said, well, my mother reminded me that we just keep on keeping on. She says, keep on keeping on. I said, well, she's 70. She's been doing it for 50 years and she's still doing it. And she said, oh, okay, if she can do it, I can do it. And I think that's really important for us to have these kinds of conversations, to remember we're not the first. Sometimes I think I'm the first and I'm very dramatic. My mother will tell you. We live in a, you can see I'm the crier and the drama queen. And we live in an intergenerational household. And when I come back home with some of my challenges, my dad is very empathetic. And my mother says, you're very, in South Africa, we often use the word which means sort of, never mind. I've been there, I've done that. You'll survive it. So I think that's one of the things we need to do in these intergenerational conversations, hold each other's hands, tell each other, I've been there, I've done that, I'll survive it. I think I find myself doing that now with the generation that comes after me. Maybe we'll close off this conversation. Yes.
I just want to wrap up because I want to talk about some lessons for the future. Okay. And I want to remind us all that we need to have a Christ-like attitude if we're really going to bring healing in these two divides. We
can be angry though.
We can be angry, but not sin.
The tables.
No sinning, no shouting, no screaming, no knocking down doors. Just have a Christ-like attitude. Want the best God has for everybody, not just for yourself, but look beyond yourself. What is best for the whole community? We need to have an openness and an accepting heart of everybody who may be the other. We need to continue to build these strong, healthy relationships that brings healing to people, that will go across time. All this costs us. It's going to cost us time. It's going to cost us grace. We have to ask God for wisdom. We will need to give unconditional love. And I want to encourage, like you've said, find people of like passion who will strengthen your hands, who will hold hands together, who will pray with you and walk together, because it is a lonely path. Now, I started my talk, you can finish off, but I started mine with my grandmother. Her name was Dora Taylor. And one day the minister came to visit. And he came with his hat in his hand, and she said to me as he came in, Esme, put the kettle on and make some tea. I was about 12 years old. And so I was busy making the tea, and suddenly I saw him walking out of the door and put his hat on outside. And this is what my grandmother said to him. I know you've come to confront me, but I need you to know that I will speak out for all young women God will bring into the leadership in this church, so that they can be treated with dignity and respect. I became the youth leader. I became the Sunday school superintendent. My grandmother opened the door for me. That was 70 years ago. She and the minister had a fight.
60 something.
60 years ago. She and the minister had a fight at the board meeting. And so he came to check her, to tell her she must not be like that. And she decided she was going to open the door and make sure that there would be a space for young people to come in. So that's my grandmother. That's your great-grandmother. I have a granddaughter. I will continue to make a space for her to be successfully working in God's kingdom wherever He calls us. So now you can stop crying and you can...
So I hadn't heard that story before. And my grandmother was quite powerful too. So my mother made me cry. This is awful. My voice went all octave higher. For a public speaker, that's a terrible thing. But my dad taught me it's okay to cry, not my mother. That's a powerful story. I mean, I think that's exactly what we need to be doing, is keeping on opening those doors. And the ceilings are still there, the doors are still there, unfortunately. There are doors we have walked through, or that we continue to walk through. And we need to be holding those doors open for those coming behind us. That's what she did.
Yeah.
I think that's what you still do. By the way, my mother does mentoring, doesn't just mentor me. She's not my only mentor, don't worry. But she mentors many people now, also globally. And I think part of it has been holding that door open for others behind us. I think some generations have felt that they need to shut the door because they want to hold on to the power. That's not what leadership is about. It's about holding the door open and sometimes even accompanying that generation through the door with them and showing them what lies beyond, and then saying, well, you go the next step and you walk the journey, but I'm right there behind you. So I think that's a good way to end it, with me crying as per usual. But as I said, my dad says it's okay. And I think that's also what good allies do.
Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to further answering your
Engaging
questions
with you.
and engaging with you.